All right, good to know. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that worked. I'll speak freely for a little bit and then switch into the share screen. So yes, as people were mentioning, I'm working on this book on the Phaedo. I'm in the final stages of this, and I'm going to talk today about part of my chapter on the autobiography. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to focus on some issues that come up at the beginning of the autobiography. The autobiography is, of course, one of the most discussed parts of Plato's entire corpus. Alongside the recollection argument, it seems to be the most discussed part of the Phaedo. And it very well may be the most influential part of the dialogue, since it seems to be what may be our very first Greek reflections on how to do natural science. It provides a classic account of inquiry with the method of hypothesis, and it includes an important discussion of forms. I'm not going to be talking about the method of hypothesis or forms today, but instead on these reflections about how to do natural science. Now, I think precisely because this discussion has been so influential, people tend to read it in terms of its reception, Aristotle and others that came after him, rather than the intellectual context in which Plato was writing, Socrates was thinking about these things. And so part of what I want to do here today is to try to place the autobiography within its intellectual context with the hope that that will help clarify it. So ancient philosophy scholars frequently overlook the sophisticated discussion of iti, causes, and hypotheses in 5th century medical treatises. And in this talk, I'm going to argue that Socrates is critically engaging with claims in this tradition, specifically about iti. I'm further going to argue that the autobiography shows how Socrates, as portrayed throughout his dialogues, throughout Plato's dialogues, would engage with the natural scientific tradition. He shows his hallmark profession of ignorance. He becomes excited by the prospect of acquiring knowledge of the good. But since he's unable to learn this from Anaxagoras and others, he proceeds in a way that doesn't require substantive knowledge. Instead, he hypothesizes the existence of the things that he's always searching for, the things sought by his what is it question. Now, whether or not the historical Socrates ever had the sort of intellectual journey described here, Plato presents a distinctly Socratic response to the natural scientific tradition. So whereas scholars often treat the autobiography as if it's something entirely new, what I want to do is to say it is importantly new, but it's important to see the innovations in light of the medical background and as an example of a typical Socratic approach. Okay, so the other major thing that I want to argue for here today is that in order to understand Socrates' discussion, we need to carefully distinguish between the adjective aitios, aition, which from now on I'm just going to refer to in its neuter form of aition, and the noun aitia. I will not in today's talk say much about the second half of Socrates' discussion, where he turns to his positive proposal that having a share of a form is an idea and his method of hypothesis. Instead, my goal here is to understand his basic framework for inquiry. Okay, so there's a kind of overview of what I'll be doing. And now let me go back to the share screen, which of course now isn't working. Let me try again. There we are. Okay. So as I was just saying, my central theses are that Socrates is critically engaging with claims in early Greek medical tradition about iti. That the autobiography shows how Socrates, as portrayed throughout Plato's dialogues, would engage with the natural scientific tradition, and that we need to carefully distinguish between aition and the noun itia. Okay. So, Socrates says that research into nature, periphyseos hysteria, involves knowing the idea of each thing. His autobiography then describes his search for ITI. Unfortunately, it's difficult to understand what an idea is supposed to be, and so what Socrates is searching for. Clarifying this is crucial for understanding why he rejects some proposed accounts and accepts others. Indeed, divergent accounts of the autobiography frequently hinge on divergent accounts of what an idea should be. My central claim is that in order to become clearer about this, we need to distinguish idea from ition. Now, Socrates describes the search for ITI as the search for that because of which each comes to be, that because of which it passes away, and that because of which it is. In Socrates' examples, he always fills this out with a predicate complement, either comes to be or is. So he'll tell us because of what something is larger, or because of what it comes to be to, or because of what it is in the center. Typically, the explanandum is taken as obvious. For example, it's clear that one person is larger than another. But if the explanandum in question is in question, one first states the fact, for example, that the Earth is a sphere, and then the idea because of which this is the case. Now, Michael Freda noted that in the Greek legal context, as well as in ordinary Greek, the adjective aition is applied to the person or thing responsible for a crime. The noun idea can simply mean responsibility, but in a legal context, it's the accusation. That is, it describes what someone allegedly is responsible for doing. Freda suggested briefly that Socrates distinguishes between these two terms in the Phaedo, with aition identifying the thing responsible, and according to Freda, the idea, a propositional item that identifies this as responsible. Freda was thinking a little bit about the later Stoic use of these terms. Lennox and Mueller agree that these terms differ, but Mueller already had cast doubt on the idea that the idea should be thought of as propositional. However, Irwin, Sedley, Ledbetter, and Wolfsdorf have all raised doubts that these words are clearly distinguished in the Phaedo, and in general, no distinction is observed in more recent secondary literature or in translations. Both are typically translated simply as cause. Okay, so idea is Socrates' favored term in the autobiography. While it's sometimes ambiguous which term he's using, by my count, he uses the noun idea 24 times in this part of the dialogue, at least twice on every page from 96 to 101. He uses the adjective 11 times, 5 of them in a single cluster, when he distinguishes the aition thing from that without which something could never be aition. On its own, aition normally means responsible. Now, 2 of the 11 occurrences of aition are with a neuter article, forming a noun. In theory, these could pick out an abstract noun, but in fact, in both cases, they seem to refer to a thing which is responsible. They're not equivalent to an abstract noun. Okay. So, in Socrates' description of Anaxagoras' theory, he clearly uses aition in an importantly different way from idea. Socrates reports that according to Anaxagoras, nous orders and is aition for everything. Socrates then says, if this is so, then the idea concerning each thing is it's being best for it to be that way. So, for example, the idea of the Earth being spherical is its being best to be spherical. Describing this idea requires explaining why it's better for the Earth to be this way, which requires knowing what is better and what is worse. So according to this theory, only one thing, nous, is aition for everything, but the idea of each thing is different. The idea of the Earth being in the center of the universe would describe why it's best for it to be there. This is different from the idea of why the Earth is a sphere, which explains why it's best for it to be a sphere. Moreover, Socrates says that if intelligence is aition, one still needs to work to discover the idea of how each thing comes to be. Hence, aition and aitia are clearly being used differently. The tricky question is to understand what this difference is. To answer this, it's useful to briefly consider how aitio is used in 5th century treatises, that is, before the Phaedo. As noted earlier, in the Greek legal context, the aitia is the accusation, which describes what the accused, the aition, has done. Thus, in the encomium of Helen, Gorgias considers 4 accusations, ten tetran aition, against Helen, and argues that in each case she is not to blame. These accusations state by what causal dative she came to Troy. And so we get these 4 options: by the wishes of chance and the purposes of the gods and the decrees of necessity, or by force, or persuaded by speeches, or captivated by love. Okay, so there's one example for us. Another example, in the Histories, Herodotus offers a several-page long account of one aitia, the aitia of how King Darius captured Samos. Now, in these cases, it's clear who is allegedly responsible. Helen is supposedly responsible, or King Darius is supposedly responsible. But a question remains for us: how did this happen? And that's what the aitia seems to clarify. So with this in mind, let's consider the use of aitia in Herodotus's famous opening of the Histories. He says that he's presenting his research, his historia, which will discuss the idea of the hostilities between Greeks and non-Greeks. He quickly reports the Persian view that the Phoenicians are aition and that the Greeks are also aition. Here again, the aition is this simple attribution of responsibility to some specific group, person, or group, whereas aitia is what research seeks to understand, a more complicated description of how an agent is responsible. Similarly, in the 5th century Hippocratic On Ancient Medicine, the author says that correctly grasping medical knowledge in its entirety would provide the following research, historia: knowing what a human is and because of what sort of aitia it comes to be, and other such things with precision. Socrates is clearly echoing this way of thinking when he says that research into nature, periphyseos historia, involves knowing the aitia of each thing. In these works, aitia is used to describe in detail, sometimes in great detail, how the aition thing is aition. Knowledge comes from properly grasping this, not merely who or what is responsible. Once you grasp the aitia, you understand why the explanandum is the way it is, why Helen is in Troy, or why there are these hostilities between the Greeks and non-Greeks, or why a human being comes to be. Now, what's unusual about the aitia that Socrates expected Anaxagoras to provide, if intelligence were aition, is that they do not mention intelligence at all. It's as if you made an accusation without mentioning the perpetrator at all. The reason for this, I think, is twofold. First, according to this proposal, intelligence is responsible for everything. Now, normally a number of different people are candidates for being responsible, and seeing how this person is responsible helps to show that they in fact are responsible. If Nous is responsible for everything, then there's no reason to mention it at all. Second, Socrates thinks that if Nous is responsible, we know ahead of time how it's going to be responsible. It would arrange each thing in the way that's in fact best. Thus, if we determine what is in fact best, we know how intelligence arranges things. It's as if we have a perfect alphabetizer. It's as if a perfect alphabetizer alphabetizes every file in a catalog. There's no need to point out facts about the alphabetizer. If someone asks why this file comes before that one, you can simply point to the fact about alphabetical order. Because it's a perfect alphabetizer, there's no need to point out anything in particular about this person. By contrast, according to Socrates' own view, the idea of X being F is that X has a share in the form of Fness. The form of Fness seems to me to be what's responsible, aition. There's just one thing that's responsible, but the idea describes how this form is responsible for a given thing's being beautiful by having a share of that form. According to this theory, unlike the nous theory, the idea includes what is aition. This is because there isn't one thing that's responsible for everything on this theory, but rather different forms are responsible for different things. Now, Socrates doesn't only use these terms aition and aitia when describing what he's looking for. He also uses the causal dative, typically translated by, and the preposition dia with the accusative, because of. As far as I can tell, the causal dative is always used with a noun that's purportedly aition. By contrast, dia with the accusative typically is used for a larger fact, the aitia. For example, the causal dative is used to say that one person is larger than another by a head. And dia with the accusative is used to say that 10 is more numerous than 8 because of, quote, there being 2 added to it. But Socrates does sometimes use dia with the accusative for a noun that is purportedly aition. For example, he says that something is larger both by and because of largeness, or by and because of smallness, or by and because of numerousness. Okay, so I didn't put that part into a slide. Let's return to the idea that research into nature involves grasping the idea. Simply recognizing what is responsible is not sufficient for understanding this thing's responsibility. By contrast, once one grasps the idea, one has reached the goal of one's research, because one can see in virtue of what this thing is responsible. Understanding why it's best for the earth to be a sphere allows one to understand in virtue of what nous is responsible for this. It's sometimes suggested that in the Phaedo there's a sort of transparency or intelligible connection between a cause and an explanandum. This doesn't seem to hold between what is aition and the explanandum. Simply grasping that intelligence is responsible doesn't transparently explain or make intelligible why the earth is in the center. Nor does grasping the form of largeness transparently explain why Simmias is larger than Socrates. But there is a sort of transparency between the idea and the explanandum. If Simmias has a share of largeness with respect to Socrates, it's clear why Simmias is larger than Socrates. If nous is aition, and it's better for the earth to be in the center, it's clear why the earth is in the center. This clarifies why the goal of research is to come to know the idea. Doing so is what makes the explanandum intelligible. Some scholars have claimed that in the Phaedo, a cause is necessary and sufficient for the explanandum. This doesn't seem to be true for what is aition. The form of largeness is not sufficient for Socrates to be larger than Simmias, nor is a head sufficient for Simmias to be taller than Socrates. In fact, Socrates goes on to suggest that his decision to stay in prison is a reasonable candidate for what's responsible for his being in prison, although such a decision is neither necessary nor sufficient for being in prison. There's many other explanations for why he might be there, and Socrates could decide to stay in prison, but be dragged away by his friends. But the two major theories of aitai that Socrates considers, the one involving nous and the other one involving forms, they do seem to identify aitai that are necessary and sufficient. Suppose that nous is aition, then it's best for the earth to be a sphere is necessary and sufficient for its being a sphere. Similarly, if Socrates' forms theory is right, then Simmias having a share of largeness is necessary and sufficient for his being large. I don't see any clear evidence in the text that Socrates is thinking of ITI in terms of necessity or sufficiency, but perhaps he is in the cases of those two theories. Okay, so a caveat. I'm not claiming here, nor am I denying that Plato uses aition and aitia differently in other dialogues, simply that he is using them differently here. It's not unusual for Plato to distinguish words in one dialogue that he doesn't in other dialogues, and we can understand why he would do so here, since he's in a somewhat technical discussion. I maintain that, that in the autobiography, Nicaea consistently explains in virtue of what the aition thing is aition. But if there's an exception to this, that doesn't automatically undermine there being an important conceptual distinction, which he generally expresses with these terms. Okay, so far I've said nothing about this topic of perennial debate for a while of how we should translate aition and aitia. Ever since this famous paper by Vlastos in 1969, well, and especially in the 70s and 80s, there was a debate about whether to translate it as cause or something like reason or explanation. Well, I think we should translate aition as responsible, and that's how I will do for the remainder of this talk. Aitia is significantly trickier. Ideally, one would retain its close connection, linguistic connection to aition, but at the same time, as described in the next section, Socrates is working within a rich scientific tradition in which aitia is a technical term. Neither accusation nor responsibility seem to capture its meaning. Perhaps causal description fits with this quasi-technical sense, but that has no linguistic connection to responsible, and a description is a linguistic item, whereas the aitia seems to be the thing described. And so I'm just going to leave aitia untranslated for this talk, but I still haven't found a better translation than cause for the term. Now, however we translate it, Socrates is operating with a concept that some have thought doesn't line up very well with our ordinary notion of cause. An aitia need not be an event, it need not be temporally prior to what it causes, nor need it have several other features that some contemporary philosophers require of causes. Though contemporary philosophical views on causation are in fact quite different now than they were in the 60s through 80s, when Vlastos' position was developed and most thoroughly discussed. While we might expect all causes to belong to some broad category, such as event, object, or power, Socrates treats anything that could answer the because of what question as a candidate for being aition, or an aitia. The things he puts forward as aition include food, a head, division, nous, and the form of beauty. He doesn't reject any of them on the grounds that they belong to the wrong category. Scholars sometimes speak of Socrates as having causal laws in the Phaedo. Socrates doesn't lay down at the beginning any general requirements for being either aition or an aitia. Instead, what I'm going to argue is that he slowly reveals an implicit requirement for being aition as he criticizes other accounts. When he provides his own account, he repeatedly points out how it avoids the problems that the initial accounts faced. I'll argue that Socrates consistently rejects candidates for failing to make a difference to whether or not there is the explanandum. For example, failing to make a difference as to whether or not something is large. I call this the difference maker requirement, and I argue that it underwrites Socrates' two main requirements that involve opposites, that the same thing cannot be responsible for opposites, and that opposites can't be responsible for the same thing. Sorry, I forgot to advance the slide, as I sometimes will do. Okay, so that finishes that section, and I'm going to move on to think a little bit about ancient Greek medicine. Reflections on early Greek natural philosophy tend to focus on the early Greek cosmologists, such as Anaxagoras. Now, these cosmologists don't use the words with the IT stem in our fragments, aside from a few fragments by Democritus, which keep the original sense of a person responsible. The one exception is this fragment that some have doubted its authenticity, B118, in which Democritus is reported to have said that he would rather discover a single causal account, aitiologion, than acquire the kingdom of the Persians. Okay, so maybe there was one use by cosmologists in the 5th century, or maybe none at all. This word, aitiologion, is not used in any other 5th century treatise or source. By contrast, the aitia stem words are used very, very frequently in works by Greek medical writers, most of whose works have come down to us under the name of Hippocrates. Some of these authors are interested in cosmology, others oppose the role of cosmology in medicine. But in general, ancient Greek medicine frequently presents itself as a craft, a techne, that draws on and contributes to research into nature, periphyseus hysteria. Socrates seems to refer to questions and views in this medical tradition when he introduces the questions pursued by the study of nature. Questions like, is it when the hot and cold start to decompose that living things grow into a unity? Or is it by blood that we think, or air, or fire? Or is it none of these, but rather the brain? These are the sort of questions that we see debated in these early Greek medical treatises. Now, what I want to focus on is the sophistication of the Hippocratic treatments of aitia and aition. And I want to do this so that we can see what is innovative about Socrates' approach in the Phaedo, as well as how he's developing and appropriating ideas from his predecessors. Now, on ancient medicine is a reasonable candidate for the most sophisticated treatment of aitia and aition in a 5th century Greek medical text. The overall goal of this treatise is to reject hypothesizing of aitia in medicine and to put the author's preferred procedure in aitia in place. Later, in a part of this chapter that I'm not going to read today, I defend the view that Socrates' method of hypothesis is meant to avoid.
E non c'è nada?
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, everything's okay. All right. So in other work, I defend the view that Socrates' method of hypothesis is meant to avoid the sort of attack on the use of hypotheses found in this treatise. Now, in this treatise on ancient medicine, it frequently argues against a hypothesis by arguing that the thing hypothesized as responsible, as aition, that those things are present, and yet the explanandum isn't there. Or arguing that the explanandum is present, but the things that are hypothesized as responsible aren't there. And so there's a sort of lack of connection between these two. The most nuanced treatment of causation, it seems to me to be the argument in 19.3 that the things responsible for certain diseases are specific fluxes. And this is perhaps the earliest articulation of an idea that we have something like a cause needs to be necessary and sufficient for its effect. One must, of course, consider these fluxes. So he's referring to some specific discharges, that these fluxes to be responsible for each responsible of each condition, since their presence is necessarily accompanied by that condition in a certain form, while when they change into another blend, it ceases. So necessarily when they're there, we get it, and when they're not there, we don't. This seems to be the earliest articulation of something like the idea that a cause needs to be necessary and sufficient for its effect. Now recall that Socrates never makes such a claim in the Phaedo. Instead, as noted earlier, Socrates does not seem to think that what is responsible needs to be necessary or sufficient. In any event, Socrates' focus in the Phaedo seems to simply be that being necessary does not ensure being responsible, that this is compatible with simply being that without which the responsible thing could never be responsible. Now, at the end of the Hippocratic On Winds, after arguing that pneuma is responsible for a variety of different diseases, the author at least partially anticipates this famous distinction in the Phaedo by distinguishing what is responsible from something that's less than fully responsible. It's clear then that winds are the most active factor in all diseases. All other things are I can't even say that word, and secondarily responsible, but I have shown that this is the thing responsible for diseases. I promise to declare the thing responsible for diseases, and I have shown that pneuma has the greatest power both in other things and in the body of living creatures. I have let my discourse dwell on familiar ailments in which the hypothesis has shown itself correct. Now, of course, Socrates isn't going to accept this author's claim that winds, in fact, are what's responsible. My point is simply that this text, like the Phaedo, distinguishes what is genuinely responsible from other things which fall short of this. The Phaedo doesn't use the language of sunaitia or metaitia, but this is nonetheless similar to the Phaedo's celebrated distinction between what is responsible and that without which it could not be responsible. In sum, Socrates in the Phaedo is engaged in a tradition of natural science, which on the medical side involves sophisticated criteria for being responsible, criteria that can be used to criticize one's predecessors, to put forward rival alternatives, and to distinguish what is responsible from something less than responsible. These are not innovative features of Socrates' approach. What is innovative is the specific ways that he criticizes other accounts, the conditions that he thinks something must meet in order to be responsible, and the rival theory he advances in its place. Okay, so that was, as it were, all background for starting to read the autobiography. We need to distinguish aition from aitia. We should understand this Hippocratic background. With this in mind, let's think about how Socrates describes his initial inquiry. He reacts to his initial natural scientific investigations just as one would expect, given how he's portrayed across Plato's dialogues, especially the Socratic dialogues. So after this list of questions that he was interested in, which involve these Hippocratic questions, we get the following description. And in the end, I myself came to think that I was uniquely unqualified for this inquiry. I'll give you ample evidence for this. I was so utterly blinded by that inquiry with regard to the very things that, at least as I and others supposed, I had previously known clearly, that I unlearned those very things that earlier I had thought I knew, on many subjects, and in particular because of what a human being grows. So note here the very standard Socratic procedure. Everyone else takes certain things to be obvious. So in the Meno, what virtue is, what we want to instill in our sons in the Laches. And then they ask these fairly sophisticated questions. Is virtue teachable? Should our sons learn fighting in armor? But Socrates is having so much trouble with the topic that he can't even understand the simplest things about it. And just as in the Socratic dialogues, the problems that Socrates presents as his own turn out to be difficulties for everyone. Socrates goes on to argue in quite general terms that these causal accounts face insuperable difficulties. Now, scholars debate whether Socrates sincerely believes that he had some special difficulty understanding these topics in the Socratic dialogues. The fact that we could ask the same question here, whether he really believes he's uniquely unqualified, shows the parallelism with the Socratic dialogues. Socrates' advantage in the autobiography, just as in the Apology, is that he recognizes his ignorance. He argues that his account in terms of forms is superior to the natural philosophers while still requiring no substantive knowledge. We're seeing Socrates approach research into nature as he would an ethical or political topic. Just as people have not carefully thought through the consequences of the view that virtue is beneficial or that good things bring happiness, so too they have not carefully thought through the notion of being responsible, and so failed to recognize that even the ordinary things they identify as responsible cannot be, let alone these more sophisticated options that the natural philosophers offer. Now, after Socrates gives his general description of research into nature and his failure to succeed at it, he identifies a number of concrete accounts that he found dissatisfying. At this stage, he only explains what's dissatisfying with one of them, waiting until later when he provides his positive theory to explain the other cases. Each proposal identifies something as responsible for being or becoming larger. Now, Vlasto says that they present the modern reader with a sort of meta-puzzle. Why would Socrates find these explanations puzzling at all? But not only the modern reader is puzzled, Kebes also doesn't see what's wrong with them in 96e. Socrates is questioning ordinary explanations in a way that was surprising then as well as now. I'll argue that Socrates here begins to reveal a neutral criterion for evaluating whether something is genuinely responsible, a criterion that he clarifies later in the autobiography. Socrates begins by asking, because of what does a human grow? He thought it was obvious to everyone that it was because of flesh being added to flesh and to bone, and so too in the other cases. Then he considers the option that one person is larger than another by a head, then that 10 is more numerous than 8 because of 2 being added, and then that 2 cubits is larger than 1 by exceeding by half. Now, 2 of these are purported explanations for one thing coming to be, a human coming to be larger, or 10 coming to be from 8. And 2 of them are purported explanations of being, one person being larger than another, or 2 cubits being larger than 1. And so we want some way of trying to understand how it would apply to both of these. Socrates' final example offers a diagnosis of what's wrong with at least one of these accounts. And so that's what I'll look at next. And it's a long enough passage that I'm afraid I couldn't fit the Greek on here, but I thought it was worth us going through. I'm a long way indeed from thinking that I know the idea of any of these. I don't allow myself to say even that when someone adds 1 to 1, either the one it was added to has become 2. There's a question here about whether to insert in, or that the one that was added has become 2, or the one that was added and the one it was added to becomes 2, because of the addition of the first to the second. For I find it astonishing that when each of them was apart from the other, each turned out to be 1, and that they weren't 2 at that time, but when they came near to each other, this supposedly became responsible for their coming to be 2, namely the union that is their being put near each other. No, nor can I persuade myself that if someone divides 1, this, the division, has now become responsible for its coming to be 2. For then the opposite of the earlier cases seemed to be responsible for coming to be 2. Back then, you see, it was because they were brought together into proximity with each other, and one was added to the other. But now it's because they are brought apart and the one is separated from the other. Now, in fact, I think we should reject Wittenbach's conjecture. However, even if we accept it, the point of this whole phrase that we get there at the beginning, either the one that was added to or, is to not choose between these possibilities, precisely because Socrates wishes to highlight a problem that applies regardless of what it is that becomes 2. The problem is introduced in the next sentence with the gar clause. Socrates is astounded that the union would be responsible for such a thing. And to explain why this is astounding, he points out that division would have an equal claim to being responsible for the same effect. One thing, addition, cannot be responsible since its opposite, division, has an equal claim to being responsible. This reason to reject a candidate has nothing to do with becoming or with becoming per se, and so could equally well be used to reject a candidate as responsible for being. Why is this a minimal requirement on X as being responsible for Y. The opposite of X can't have an equal claim on being responsible for Y. Socrates might seem to think that whatever is responsible must be necessary for Y. If the opposite of X could also be responsible for Y, then X is clearly not necessary. However, Socrates goes on to suggest that his decision to stay in prison is a reasonable candidate for, for what's responsible for his being in prison, and such a decision is not necessary for being in prison. There are many other explanations for why he might be there. I think it's simply unclear at this stage exactly what Socrates thinks the problem is. I think we readers are supposed to be puzzled about what Socrates' concern is until we see how the story develops. In the next part of his autobiography, Socrates makes clear that he thinks that other people are not carefully considering the meaning of the word IQ. My suggestion is that Socrates thinks that careful consideration about responsibility underwrites his rejection of addition as responsible. And the idea would be this: something genuinely responsible makes a difference to the outcome. If the opposite thing has an equal claim on being responsible, then it is clearly not genuinely what's making a difference. It's not genuinely responsible. It doesn't meet what I was calling the difference maker requirement. Rather than being archaic or simplistic, Socrates' focus on opposites brings out the most extreme cases where it's especially clear that we must not have identified what's genuinely responsible. Okay, so let's turn now to what Socrates thought Anaxagoras was going to do. And this is a stretch of text that's extremely difficult to read uncolored by Plato and Aristotle's subsequent works, the Republic, Timaeus, Aristotle's Natural Teleology. I just urge us to approach the passage, at least at first, on its own terms, before deciding how well it lines up with the texts. I'm going to argue that Socrates is primarily interested in and excited about Anaxagoras' proposal because he thinks it offers the possibility of acquiring knowledge of the good, not because of any special insight that it would offer into the natural world. Socrates begins with what he thought when somebody reading from a book by Anaxagoras said that it turns out that Nous both orders things and is responsible for everything. Socrates reports, I was pleased with this idea, and it struck me that in a way it is good that Nous should be responsible for everything. And I suppose that if this is the case, when Nous is doing the ordering, it orders everything and places each thing in whatever way is best. Socrates makes clear here that he's providing his account of what it would mean for Nous to order all things and be responsible for everything. He supposed that if this were the case, Nous would place each thing in whatever way is best. Socrates says later that he hadn't even read Anaxagoras' book yet, right? So he just hears somebody reading this and immediately comes up with, oh, this is what it would mean. In several Socratic dialogues, Socrates says that to the extent that people are guided by knowledge or wisdom, they're benefited. Apology, Gorgias, Protagoras. In the Meno, he explicitly says that Nous benefits and that what is done without Nous harms. It's at 88b. It is natural then that Socrates would interpret the idea that Nous is responsible as meaning that it does things in the best way. I'm not going to fill in my argument for this today, but I don't think that there is evidence that Socrates holds in general that any idea would need to be related to the good. Instead, this is a result of supposing that Nous in particular is responsible. That's what creates the connection to the good. Further signs that Socrates is interpreting Anaxagoras' claim in a distinctly Socratic way is that he immediately goes on to mention the idea that there's a single knowledge that will encompass both the best and the worst, which is closely connected to his idea that, that we find in many Socratic dialogues, that the knowledge of the good is the same as that of the bad. Socrates thinks that if Nous is responsible, then to identify an idea, one would need an account of what is best. And Socrates shows exactly the enthusiasm you would expect from his encountering the chance to acquire knowledge of what's best. Oh, sorry, there's the Greek. I got hold of his books with real excitement and started reading them as quickly as I could so that I might know as quickly as possible the best and the worst. Note that he doesn't say so that I might know as quickly as possible the shape of the earth, or so I might know as quickly as possible where the earth is in relation to the moon. No, what he's excited about is acquiring knowledge of the best. Throughout the dialogues, this, of course, is the knowledge that Socrates is most eager to find, the knowledge that would allow him to acquire virtue and so be happy. There's no indication that he's excited here about an approach to the study of nature. Okay, so Socrates supposed that any theory that made nous responsible would explain everything in terms of the best. However, Socrates then complains that Anaxagoras in fact assigned responsibility to air, ether, water, and other such absurdities. Now, one might expect Socrates to make an internal critique of Anaxagoras, since he didn't make nous responsible, despite claiming that he would. Or to think that any idea must be in terms of the best, and so to criticize Anaxagoras for not identifying what's best. Instead, Socrates objects to Anaxagoras' de facto account using a neutral criterion for being responsible that has nothing to do with nous or the best. He objects using an analogy. He says that Anaxagoras' theory is just as if someone said that it's because of nous that Socrates does everything that he does, but then says that he is sitting in prison because his body is composed of bones and sinews, and then provided an account of how the bones and sinews allow him to be bent here in the sitting position. This person would also assign responsibility to voices, air, and ears failing to identify the real ITI, which he identifies as, namely that since the Athenians have decided that it was better to condemn me, on account of that, I too have also decided that it's better to sit here, and more just to stay put and suffer whatever punishment they decree. Socrates explains why these are the real ITI, not the bones and sinews, as follows. For by the dog, I think these sinews and bones would have long would long have been in Megara or Boeotia, transported by an opinion as to what is best, if I didn't think it more just and honorable to suffer whatever punishment the city imposes, rather to escape and run away. The problem with the bones and sinews as responsible is that they are no more responsible for his staying than for his going. By contrast, Socrates' decision is responsible for his staying in a way that it would not be for his going. If he left, perhaps bound and carried away by his companions, it would be despite his decision, not because of it. The problem with the bones and sinews is analogous to that with addition and division. In that earlier case, Socrates threw out a candidate because the opposite thing would have an equal claim to being responsible for the same explanandum. In this case, the same thing is allegedly responsible for staying in prison or for being in Megara or Boeotia. Now, if one thought that Socrates were operating with some strict causal principles here about opposites, it would be important to determine whether being in Megara or Boeotia is truly an opposite to staying in prison. I've suggested that the key point is not about opposites per se, but about whether something is genuinely making a difference. The bones and sinews do not make a difference to whether Socrates is in prison or to the very different and incompatible situation that he's in Megara or Boeotia. Hence, they are no more responsible for the one than for the other. By contrast, Socrates' opinion, in fact, makes a difference to whether he's in prison. There are several signs that Socrates thinks that the problem is not identifying what, strictly speaking, is responsible. He says to call such things, the bones and sinews, responsible, aition, is very absurd. A few lines later, Socrates says that people are fumbling in the dark who call something responsible, when instead it is that without which the responsible thing could never be responsible. He says that such people are using the name responsible for something that applies to something else. Now note this attention to calling and naming. as well as the idea that people are failing to make a distinction. This suggests that Socrates thinks that people are not clearly thinking through the meaning of the term responsible. Socrates also uses the verb aitiasthai here, which means to assign responsibility. Socrates is carefully thinking through the notion of being responsible by considering human agency, which is, of course, its core application. He uses this to argue that natural scientists have not identified what's genuinely responsible. Now, how would Anaxagoras' intelligence avoid the problem that the bones and sinews fall into, being no more responsible for one thing than its opposite? After all, if intelligence is responsible for everything, it would seem to be responsible for opposite things. Well, one question here is about the scope of panta, of everything. Socrates says that he expected an account of Anaxagoras about the sun, moon, and the other celestial bodies, and these are the only examples he considers. I suspect we're supposed to understand everything here is covering cosmology, not such questions as why one leaf is larger than another. Moreover, and more importantly, Socrates seems to expect Anaxagoras to settle questions about opposites. Socrates wanted to know from Anaxagoras why it's better for the Earth to be round or flat, in the center rather than in orbit, and other such things. To give an idea, given that nous is responsible, one would need to know which is better. Nous would be that which makes a difference to whether the Earth is spherical or flat. What if it, in fact, is no better for the Earth to be spherical than it is for it to be flat? Well, then nous would be like the bones and sinews, no more responsible for its being a sphere than for its being flat. Socrates thinks it's incumbent on someone defending Anaxagoras' account to explain not only what goodness is, but also how this can be responsible for everything in the cosmos. By contrast, one great advantage of Socrates' form theory is that it doesn't require this sort of substantive knowledge. You can tell that the form of justice will never be responsible for injustice without knowing what justice is or knowing which things are just and which unjust. Okay, so let me provide a brief conclusion. Sorry, I'm running over a couple minutes here. I've argued that in order to understand Socrates' project in the autobiography, we need to distinguish aition from aitia. To identify something as aition is simply to identify it as responsible. To identify something as an aitia is typically much more substantive. Grasping this is what's supposed to provide one with the sort of knowledge that's involved in research into nature. The aitia is that by which the responsible thing is responsible. So with this background in place, Socrates enters into an existing theoretically rich discussion of which things are aition and which things are aitia. In the early Greek medical context, a tradition that, for example, distinguishes what's genuinely aition from that which falls short. Socrates approaches this existing tradition just as you would expect him to when coming to some sophisticated theory. He says that he's ignorant and confused, and that he's going to ask a few apparently trivial questions that are confusing him, but which in fact seem to tear down the whole edifice. He argues that most theories on offer do not identify something that even could be genuinely responsible. But Anaxagoras has an exciting proposal about what would be genuinely responsible. However, to make his theory work, one would need to have substantive knowledge of the good. Anaxagoras didn't seem to have that, and Socrates certainly doesn't have it. Instead, what Anaxagoras actually proposes falls into the same sort of problems as the earlier set of proposals. All right, that is it. Thank you so much for your patience, and I hope if you did pre-read, it wasn't too boring listening to me give the talk again.
David, thanks very much for the talk. Now we're going to have some questions. Does anyone have a question? Yes, Axel.
Thank you so much, Edgar. Can you hear me? Okay.
I hear you
Good.
well.
Oh,
Thank
well,
you.
first of all, thank you for giving us the chapter, the handout, and the slides. That helped us a lot. At least it helped me a lot follow. And I am pretty much convinced about most of what you say. However, I have a small issue because I do.
Just like Socrates. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what. Because I can see how the requirement of making a difference explains why the same thing cannot generate opposites. I think that's straightforward. And I think you're also right that it doesn't require just being opposites. The opposite is just the extreme case of different. But you also want it to be the other way around, right? You write, when you make the analogy between the first case where it is opposites being candidate causes. Well, candidate, that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way because that is the dual, right? There, what we need is to explain why something cannot be the cause of something else because its opposite it's also present there, and that is the dual. So it doesn't work that way because both things could be making the same difference, and still if they're opposites, then they would have to be thrown away, right?
Okay, and first of all, you and anyone else is welcome to just call an idea a cause from now on. Use responsible for ITON now that that's so. I'm not sure that I got it.
Okay, I'm gonna read the passage. You say, in that earlier case, Socrates threw out a candidate because the opposite thing would have an equal claim to being responsible for the same explanando.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, the same thing is allegedly responsible for, and then you have 1 and 2, which are supposed to be different. But they're not the same, right? One is the dual of the other. They're not. In what case is two opposite things being candidate for being responsible, and the other we have one candidate being responsible for opposites or for different.
Yeah.
And so that's why I can see how the second case is covered by the make a difference condition, but not how it covers the first one.
So you don't see how it works with addition and division?
Yes.
That's the one that you wanted to ask about. Okay, good. So the thought is, I say addition is what's responsible for this being 2. And somebody says, why would you possibly think that addition is what's responsible for this being 2? Addition makes no difference whatsoever to whether this thing is 2. After all, division could do just as good of a job of explaining why this thing is 2. It doesn't seem to be what makes a difference to whether something is 2 or not. You could take the completely opposite thing and come up with the same result.
No, that doesn't work. I mean, it does make a difference. I mean, division makes a difference because the presence of division is sufficient, and the presence of, well, that kind of division, right? To divide an object in 2 is sufficient for there being 2, just as adding 1 to 1 also is sufficient for there being 2. So both of them, each one makes a difference whenever it happens. So it is not because they do not make a difference that you can exclude these possible causes. I don't know if you see why.
I think I see the thought. I don't know if this helps or not. You tell me. Well, addition and division, they're completely opposites. You could also end up with 2 through subtraction. You could also end up with 2 through multiplication. You could also end up with 2. It's not. So the thought is the thing that you've picked out is what's explaining why this is 2. Doesn't seem to do a good job of explaining why it's 2 because of precisely what we would want is something that it would explain a difference as to whether this thing is 2 or not. And yet it seems like there's a huge number of possibilities that would do that. I don't know, does that help?
And no, but I think I'm taking a lot of time but I can move my way back to the line and give a second try there. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Axel. I had a point related to this, David, but I think Ricardo was before. So Ricardo, would you like to make your questions?
But if your question is about this,
your question is not about this. Yours is not about this.
Not about this precise.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, yeah. Thanks, Ricardo. Just make this question, and I have another one, but I will leave it for later. So David, I think that maybe the problem is, or part of the problem may be that you don't explain how we should understand the idea of making a difference, right? Because it's clear that you don't want it to be a necessary and sufficient relation, not even a necessary relation, maybe not even a sufficient relation, right? I mean, because I mean, you don't agree with Balsi and that you want to reject that view. But then it is not clear how we should understand that something makes a difference, right? Because I mean, the idea of making a difference is something like take the thing away. I mean, if you take X away, then you wouldn't have Y or something like that, right? It's because without X, you don't have Y. That's because it makes a difference, right? But then, I mean, that cannot be understood as you say in terms of necessary sufficient conditions. And the only option I see is to understand it as some contemporary philosophers do in terms of a counterfactual claim, right? Something like, if X had not been the case, then Y had not been the case, then Y would not have been the case, or something like that. And what I'm unclear is whether, if you understand it that way, then it is not clear that you can explain the case Axel was worried about with your notion of making a difference, right? Because it seems that division may make a difference for that thing being 2, because if division had not happened, I mean, had not occurred, then the thing would not have been 2 in a way. I mean, it may be that there are other ways in which something can be 2, but the thing, it seems that division would make a difference in that in that case, right? So you can have the other case, as Axel says, because, but this is more difficult perhaps, unless you give an account of making a difference that can capture this intuition that Socrates seems to be defending. Yeah.
Good. So I want to say two things here, and I don't know that it'll be enough. I don't know that it'll suffice to make either of you happy, but maybe it'll help. So first of all, I take it that there's a whole literature in thinking about causation in which people think about questions of like overdetermination and these sort of issues. And then we run into problems with necessary and sufficient conditions. And in part, I'm trying to sort of sidestep a number of those issues. We want to track what in fact makes a difference here. And, you know, once you start going down the road of counterfactuals, well, what if, you know, the person would have died even if the bullet hadn't hit them because they have a bad heart condition, or, you know, like you start to run into these sort of problems. So that's one reason why I'm trying to focus on what I take to be the more intuitive idea of making a difference, rather than something like a counterfactual case. I do take it that within the text, we get a distinction between that without which the thing which is responsible could be responsible, and the thing which is in fact responsible and the cause. Now, what's included in the cause does not include that without which the thing could never be responsible. You don't put in the bones and sinews there, although they are clearly necessary. So I take it that it's pretty clear we don't want necessary things put in here. And then it doesn't seem like it could suffice, because you've left out things that are necessary. So maybe it is one necessary condition among others, but then the example he gives doesn't actually seem to involve something that's necessary, right? So these are the considerations that were pushing me against necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, I think nonetheless, so that was all by way of a little bit of defense. There is something that continues to puzzle me about this, which I think that you're both putting your fingers on, and which I don't feel like I've gotten myself to the bottom of. And that is, I don't know if this is quite the right language to describe this in, but it seems to me like he's thinking in terms of types rather than in terms of tokens. And it's as if addition in general could explain something's being 2 just as well as division in general does. And then you say, but look, in this particular case, if we hadn't added these 2 things together, we wouldn't have had 2. And being told that division is the sort of thing that could explain something's being 2 doesn't sort of obviously address your saying, hey, but in this particular case, it wouldn't have been 2 without addition. And I'm not entirely sure how to think about the sort of the token case versus the type considerations. And I think that that's part of Axel's question, at least. He seems to want to identify something that is the type of thing to be responsible, not simply a token thing. But as I say, I don't think that I'm at the bottom as to exactly why. Edgar, did that?
Yes. That's helpful. Yes. As you say, I was formulating in terms of tokens. Right? I mean,
yeah, and I do feel like he's working on the level of types, and how exactly, like, what's the justification for that, and how to carefully articulate the difference maker requirement so that that makes sense is not something that I feel completely clear on yet. So I'm glad that you're pressing me here.
Okay. Yes, we may come back to this later then. Ricardo, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. David, I have two groups of questions. And one of them is this, is the relation between Ition and Itia in Anaxagoras, according to Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say that the Anaxagoras that appears in the Phaedo, in this long passage that you examine, the Anaxagoras that appears there is the first author where we find a clear-cut division or distinction between Ition and Itia. So my question is about that. So it's not an objection. It's just that I want to try to understand better your reconstruction. So you say that they are different, and I agree. I know the ition is the nous. No, is nous is I mean it's that which is responsible for everything that happens. The single cause for everything. I mean the single factor that explains everything. And idea is rather something more linked to the identity of each thing. No, so the example you give is that of the sphericity of the Earth. No, and so the idea of each thing is is what is best, or why it is best for that thing to be in that particular state. So in the case of sphericity and Earth, why? No, I mean, what's the idea of the fact that the Earth is spherical? Well, the idea is that this is best for the Earth. No, this is the sphericity, or no, is the best. Being spherical is the best state for the Earth to have. No, okay. So this is very different indeed. No, I mean, and what's the ition of that? I mean, it's just nous. No, now they are very different. However, they are very closely related, as you point out. So two close relations between the two concepts that you mention are these. One is that, but I'm not sure if you formulate, as I do, these relations. But one relation is this: is that the ition is somehow the explanation of the idea, because, for example, in the case of the Earth's sphericity, so the idea of that is that it is best for the Earth to be in that state. And why is that? I mean, if you ask why is this, why is it best for the Earth to be spherical? Well, the answer to that is that it is something that is determined by nous. No, so I mean, no, I mean, if nous determines something to be the case, then that is the best possible thing to happen. No, so in that case, the ition explains the idea. I mean, it's the cause of the idea, so to speak. So that's one connection. The other connection is that, but and here I'm not sure if you would agree with this, is that there is an inferential connection between ition and idea, or an epistemic connection, namely that you can infer the idea from the ition. For example, well, if I know that the ition of everything is nous, and I know that the Earth is spherical, then I can infer that sphericity is the best state for the Earth, and so I can infer the idea. So right, so I'm not sure if I'm following you. If I'm following you, would you agree that there are these two connections between ition and idea, even though the two concepts are very different from one another?
So I think you have my broad framework just right. I think I disagree on both of those, but of course I could be wrong. So let me tell you what I'm thinking in each case. So you said, well, why is this best? Why is it best for the Earth to be a sphere? That would be determined by nous. And so there'd be a way in which nous was the cause of this as being best. that isn't how I was thinking about it. So first, let me just explain how I was thinking about it, and then I'll try to explain why. I mean, there's a question as to how we understand language of determining, but I was thinking that there's an independent fact as to what's best. And nous looks to that independent fact as to what's best, and then orders things in that way, the independent fact about what's best. Just like my own nous, when I try to decide what to do, there is a fact of the matter as to what's the right way for me to act. And my nous will look to that independent fact. It doesn't determine the fact as to what's the right way for me to act. It looks to the forms and uses those to determine how to act. So I wasn't, and I was thinking similarly here, nous is doing what's in fact best. It doesn't make it in fact best. Those things just are in fact what's best. And this is why, so maybe here's starting to get a little bit of evidence for my view. This is why if you just had knowledge of what's the best and what's worse, that would be enough for you to know how nous acts. You don't need to sort of separately go and investigate nous, just learning about what's best. And I'm imagining that that would have the following sort of information in it. It turns out that the good is unity. And it turns out that being a sphere is the most unified shape that you can be. And it turns out that we want the Earth to be the best possible shape because of its role in the cosmos. You sort of put all of those three together and you know how nous is going to order things. That's why. Okay, so you have a sort of substantive conception of what the good is. The good is unity. A substantive conception of shapes, right? Which are the better shapes? Which are the more unified ones and which aren't? Nous looks to these facts and then organizes the world accordingly. Okay, good. So that was on your first.
Just a quick quick remark. Yes, okay, fine. So according to you, there is how to put it? I mean, you would say that things are good. I mean, if something is good, it's not because nous is, well, if something is good, it's not because nous has selected this thing for happening. I mean, it's the other way around. I mean, if nous brings about something, it's because it's best. I mean, and so the source of value for anything is prior to nous. I mean, there is a source of value which is, yes, that's
exactly.
Okay.
And given that we can be completely confident how nous is going to operate, if it's the case that nous is responsible for everything, we can just sort of set aside nous now and just look to what would be the best way for things to be. Once we determine those independent facts about what's the best way for things to be, we will see that that's, of course, how nous has put them.
I see. Okay. Okay, so, well, yeah, so that's one question.
Yes, and so the second question was about inferential connection of inferring the idea from the ition.
Yes.
And I think I started to address that also with the thought that Socrates seems to think that there would be some substantive knowledge that you would need to have to make Anaxagoras' proposal work. You would need to have actual knowledge of what's best and what's worse. And so I don't think that the content of the idea is just something like, it's best for the earth to be a sphere. I think that the content is something more like what I was suggesting. Goodness is unity. A sphere is the most unified shape that there is. The best shape should be in the center of the cosmos, or something of those sorts, where it's a substantive account of what's good and what's bad. Which is why Socrates thinks that's the knowledge you would need to have. He was excited because he thought, look, I'm going to find knowledge of the good, and that's going to be some highly, it doesn't have to be unity, of course. The good is order. We figure out what's the most organized way for things to be, or the most harmonious way, or, choose your favorite account of what the good is. But that's why I was thinking you can't just make this simple inference. And that's why Socrates is frustrated with Anaxagoras. You needed to give me some substantive claims to make this theory work, but you didn't do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
and I have another group of questions, but maybe I should wait, Edgar, for later.
Maybe if you want, we can now have a question by another person, and then we come back to more questions, right? So Nicholas Albin.
Thank you. And hi, David. Nice to see you again. So I really appreciate you bringing in ancient medicine into the discussion here, because I think you're right that there is a direct link there between discussions about different kinds of causes, these sort of cohesive causes versus these more antecedent causes, and how they relate these sunaitia to the actual idea. And thinking about medical theories of causation, of course, led me down the river a bit towards Galen, and how he has obviously a whole different structure of causation in his mind that would get around some of the obscurity in some of these earlier texts. But I was actually thinking of a passage of his from that the capacities of the soul follow on the body. And it always struck me as remarkably similar to the sort of biographical sketch that Socrates gives in the Phaedo, where it's not so much the same question about causation, but about immortality of the soul in Galen's text. And he's asking all these questions about how Plato could maintain that the soul is immortal, when clearly there's things in Plato that seem to say that it depends on bodily mixture and on various temperaments of the body. And there it seems that he wants to get at a deeper kind of a why question, and he's given in this sort of very personal, doubt-filled prose about all the vain attempts he's had at trying to find a reason why. And there it seems that he can pick out a certain substance like hemlock and say, yes, that is why the soul separates from the body. When somebody ingests hemlock, they whatever, and he can give another kind of cause. Well, it's because it cools the body. And that's a second level causation. So you got the substance, you've got whatever quality that substance might have. And then he gives it even a deeper kind of why question that he still hasn't been able to figure out after his whole lifetime of scrutinizing the question. And it seems that he's after, why is it that the change in the mixture should then equate to a separation of the soul from the body? So I don't know if you've given any thought to this passage and how it might relate to the passage in the Phaedo. I imagine, since he's citing Plato directly here, and he's clearly working through all these Platonic texts, that he would have been familiar with those sort of why questions in the Phaedo. I'm wondering if he's positing in your mind a similar kind of question about causation, or if he's on a different track altogether.
So let me see if I have the case clearly in mind. So the thought is that, in a sense, two things are being explained simultaneously. both the cooling in the body and the body separating from the soul. And there seems to be a single cause, which is a cause of each of them. And so those are two why questions. And then there's, as it were, a third one. Why would the one thing lead, go along with the other thing? Why would the cooling of the body happen just with the separation of the soul from the body? That's the model.
Maybe I wasn't quite as clear as I could be. I think there's two different kinds of interpretations here.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's, is the question just, why should we assume that this causal connection always holds? And then there's another kind of interpretation, which is, well, why is this somehow the way things ought to be? And there's almost like a normative sort of claim there involved. And why is it good that different mixture in the body should equate to a different relationship between the soul?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't think of anything in the Phaedo that directly engages with that. I mean, one case is there is this one place where he talks about multiple causes, but there it seems to me that he's thinking of causes in sequence. So the Athenians' decision is explaining one thing, and his decision is explaining a distinct thing. So there we have distinct explananda with distinct causes. So it's not sort of multiple explananda with the same cause. I think that maybe something that's closer to your case comes in the final immortality argument, where he describes this class of things like fire, fever, 3, where you can say in a sense that it's by the presence of heat or by the presence of fire. And so there seem to be, as it were, two things that we could use to answer a single question there. I don't actually think that that's a causal question, but it's very close to a causal question. We get this very complicated syntax there, but it's not the diate question that's being asked. But it is, as it were, very close to a diate question. As I understand it, what we have is something like, there's what brings the cause, and there's the cause itself. So fire brings the cause, and heat is the cause, and the thing is hot because of heat. But there again, it's multiple things on the one side. We're not really having multiple explananda. And so I was trying to think of some parallel cases, but I really can't think of one that's quite like what you're describing. I would almost think that the cosmological section at the end of the Phaedo, like why is the cosmos set up in this sort of way? But I don't think that offers an explanation. My tendency is to think you have to turn to the Timaeus if you want to know why the soul is connected to the body, why death works, and those questions don't seem to me to be being addressed. But it's an interesting question I hadn't thought through before. So sorry for my.
No, it's very clear. And one of the reasons I was interested in this passage in particular is because the deity in Galen's Greek in that passage is really twisted in the Arabic version. They make it into a final clause. Now, what is the clause for the sake of which the soul separates from the body? And that's really kind of unique. In other instances, it's much more just a regular old, agent or something like that. But
no, that's interesting. Yeah, it is interesting, but I don't feel like I can say more. But
thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nicolas. So then we can come back to Axel for another question, then Ricardo, and then I can make another one if there's
Is it okay? I mean, I want to go back to the same thing again. Sorry. I just want to make because I mean, I think Edgar made even a better job than me in putting the question, but there's a reason, but I don't think it has to do that the type token distinction is going to help, because the problem can be raised just in terms of, I mean, because I think your point was that it makes a difference where we want to say whether this token of this type is the one makes it a difference, or whether it is because there's a token of this type instead of another type that is happening, right? So that is why you think the type token distinction may play a role here, right?
It's, sorry, just to clarify, it seems to me that he wants to connect an explanandum to something such that the opposite type of thing couldn't be responsible for the same explanandum.
Yeah. So yeah. So I still don't think that is going to help. Is it too, I don't know, presumptuous of me if I ask to share something? Can I share something? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I hope this. I'm especially because English is not my first language, so I think I could communicate better in written, right? So the question is what role can to make a difference play as a condition for causality, right? So it's very intuitive to think that for something to be a cause of something else, it would make a difference for it, right?
Yeah.
But I think Edgar is right, is that this is ambiguous, right? So I think the ambiguity rises between these two ways of reading it, right? For something to be the cause of something else, it must make a difference for the effect, whether or not the cause occurs, right? Or something else, right? So the difference here is in the cause clause, or to say that for the cause to be a cause, something to be the cause of something else, the cause must make a difference for whether the effect occurs or not. And here the difference is in the effect, not in the cause, right? And these are very different conditions. These are dual, but they're different. Actually, the first one I would say is very controversial, while the second one, I think it's very, very, very natural, because all the first one says is that it must make a difference for the effect, whether the cause occurred or something else did, not just its opposite, but just something else, right? But the second one says that the cause must make a difference for whether the effect occurred or something else occurred, right? So again, the difference that is made is in the effect in the second one, but it's in the cause in the first one.
Right. And just to be clear, of course, my goal is to come up with a single
exactly
thing that covers both cases, because he seems to be using analogous reasoning. It would be nice if there was a single explanation for why this would be the case. Just to be clear, yeah. No,
that was the point, because the first one is the one that's a play in the. You already got it. The first one is that it's a play in the addition subtraction, and the second one is the one that is a play in the jail, not jail. So yeah, I don't have to spell it. That was just my point. And the other point is that this works for tokens as well as for types, because if you want to like make it very, very, very explicit, the idea is that, I'm sorry, why did I close it? I'm sorry. Is that it does not make a difference whether you have a token of the type for there to be a token of the other type, or a different type, or whether it is the different types of the cause, the competing cause, the competing causes are of different types or not. In both cases, you're going to get just a quantifier over tokens, which makes it just about types. And that was clear.
So, so for some reason or other, Socrates thinks the fact that division could explain something's becoming two throws into question the idea that addition is becoming 2. So that much we need to explain, right? He somehow thinks that that should be relatively clear. And I myself find it a bit dissatisfying to just say, well, he has these laws of causation, and this is one of the laws of causation. But he never told us ahead of time. And so I'm looking for some way to try to explain why this would seem like a fairly clear idea. Here's a somewhat inchoate thought, but maybe it will help. I still think that a connection to kinds or types, he seems to want to say, if a single token of addition, if we put forward something of a single token, such that a token of the opposite type could also count as responsible, we should throw the whole thing out. Why would you think something like that? Well, here's one thought. Between types, that's where we see something like conceptual connections, essential connections, connections that will be made clear by the intellect. When you reflect on it, you can see what the connection is. And if you could give the opposite type, clearly there must not be any sort of intrinsic connection between the type and the effect, given that the opposite type will work as well. I don't feel like that thought is as clear as I would like it, but there is an attempt to try to, working backwards from the fact that he seems to think, look, this is a prima facie problem. Putting forward a case of addition when there's also cases of division. Why would he think that? Well, maybe he's looking for some sort of type level connections, and the fact that, and so then that would mean that the difference maker requirement should be operating on the type level. That one thing should, as a type, make a difference to the type of effect. And it's going to count as not, this type of thing doesn't, as a type, make a difference to this type of effect, if the opposite thing would work as well.
Yeah, I can see that that is what we did. Yeah, that is.
Yeah, so it's obviously a bit of reverse engineering from what he says but I feel like that's not an unintelligible thought, but it's going to require some more clarity on my part to try to nail it down. So anyway,
Okay.
thank you.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's very interesting as well. Ricardo?
Thank you. Well, it's a question about the text, no, which I obviously don't know as well as you do. So it's out of curiosity. You seem to what in your account of the passage, you seem to present, well, you seem to say that Socrates presents two conflicting pictures of Anaxagoras. Why? Because on the one hand, Anaxagoras, according to Socrates, according to you, on the one hand, Anaxagoras believes that the idea of something is what is best for that thing. No? But on the other, you seem to suggest that for Socrates, Anaxagoras thinks that the idea of anything is what we would call its material cause. No, so I was thinking of this passage in 98b, 99c. Well, this famous passage about the sinews, no, and well, although I see that he uses there the word "aitio," no, but it's this passage that you cite in your text. No? To call such things the bones and sinews responsible is very absurd. No. So, but that's not what Anaxagoras actually says. No, I mean, what he says is that the idea, at least, of something is its final cause, not its material cause. So why does Socrates, if I understood you well, why does Socrates gives these two conflicting pictures of Anaxagoras, or is there something that I didn't understand?
No. So as I understand Socrates' account,
Yes.
He's literally listening to somebody read a book from Anaxagoras for the first time.
Yes.
And he hears the beginning of the book. And he thinks, well, if nous is responsible for everything, and then he sort of lays out this whole agenda for what Anaxagoras would need to do if he were to really make nous responsible for everything. You would have to figure out what the idea is of each thing, which would require knowing what's best, why it's best for it to be that way. He presents no evidence that Anaxagoras ever said anything like this. In fact, he flags it's what he thought Anaxagoras, I supposed, that if this were the case, here's what we would need to do. And then we get this sort of transition sentence in which Socrates makes this joke that Anaxagoras made no use of his nous, right? So Anaxagoras didn't use his intelligence at all. Instead, what he did is he assigned responsibility to air, ether, water, and a bunch of other absurdities. And so there's what Socrates thought Anaxagoras should do given the first sentence of the work.
Okay.
And then what Anaxagoras actually did. Now, what's the problem with what he did? I'll use this analogy to the bones and sinews to explain what's wrong with what he actually did.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That answers the question. So, according to Socrates, there is a tension in Anaxagoras. No, he says one thing, but he says the opposite in.
Yes.
Okay.
I should maybe put in a little footnote here that in our fragments of Anaxagoras, we have no use of aition or aitia. So we have no evidence that Anaxagoras himself actually spoke this way. And Socrates has said, well, the goal of periphuseos hysteria is to determine the idea. And so you could sort of see why he might want to take Anaxagoras and sort of put Anaxagoras into this link. So, I mean, we could just be missing those fragments. Maybe Anaxagoras did speak that way, and we just don't know. Our best evidence would be this part of the veto for that. But I think it could very well be like when Aristotle goes through and explains what the archai are for every pre-Socratic, we should not assume that they all spoke in terms of archai just because, Aristotle has a sort of theory where he's trying to put everybody in terms of they're all searching for archai. Well, it's not a bad way to sort of rationally reconstruct what they're doing, but I don't know that it's evidence that they use the word arche. And so also we don't have any evidence aside from this passage, which doesn't seem to be a direct quotation.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Edgar, can I ask it?
Let me make a question and then we can see if there's time, because there's just, I think we have just 10 minutes left. So
Okay.
David, I just wanted to come back to one of the points that you were making with regard to Ricardo's question concerning Anaxagoras, because you don't want to say that Socrates, when he discusses Anaxagoras, that he's concerned with teleology or with final causes, right? I mean, you want to say that when Socrates takes Anaxagoras to say that Nous orders each thing for the best, I mean, he's just concerned in a project which you don't, I mean, it is not clear to me what project it is if it is not final causation. Mm-hmm. But then, but the idea is something like you were saying to Ricardo, right? I mean, if the idea is that an explanation in these terms would account for why the Earth is round rather than flat, or why it's round or flat. And you would say, well, because it is best for it to be that way. And you say, well, no, this is not final causation, because there is no nth to which that this fact is subordinate, right? I mean, it's not that the Earth is this way because of a further extrinsic end, right? Rather, the Earth is round because that's best for it to be that way. And then what it means is that goodness consists in unity, you said. That was like a hypothesis, let's say. And then roundness is like the most unitary shape, and that's why it is best for Earth to be round. And then my question is, well, I mean, yes.
Can I say one brief thing just for everyone else? So this is a part of my chapter which I did not discuss today. I'm happy to talk about it some more, but if you're not recognizing all of what Edgar said, that's because I didn't discuss this idea. But I think Edgar has it right, that what I want to say is that we don't see a strict commitment to teleology here. People have thought that if you see the word good, that must mean that there's teleology. And I want to say a commitment to teleology is to more than a commitment to something's being good. In particular, it requires a sort of subordinated structure, that certain things are good for the sake of other things. And I didn't see direct evidence for that here. So please take it away, Edgar, but I just wanted to fill that in.
No, thanks, David. No, I wasn't clear on this point, that you didn't mention this part of your text. Then but I was wondering whether I mean, teleology may come in some way, because I mean, you acknowledge that Socrates says that Anaxagoras, I mean, he expects Anaxagoras not only to explain how is it that each thing, let's say at the cosmological level, is the way it is, because it is best for it to be that way. But also he expects him to explain the common good, right? That's what Socrates says, right? And I think that one way of explaining this is that the common good is, let's say, the good of the cosmos, right? I mean, but if that is so, then there may be a way of saying that the explanation of the good for each thing is subordinate to the good of the whole cosmos in some way, because in a sense, the good is monistic for Plato or for Socrates in some way, because I mean, the good should be at the level of the cosmos also its unity, right? If it is, and so the unity of the parts may be for the sake of the unity of the cosmos, right? And in that way, I mean that's a plausible way of viewing what Socrates says about Anaxagoras, right? I mean, in that seems plausible, given that he takes this kind of philosophers to be aiming to explain not only each thing but also the cosmos, right? So what would you say about this way of bringing in teleology, right? I mean,
Good. So first of all, I wanted to say, absolutely, that is consistent with what he says. One possible way that you could think about the relationship between the individual good and the common good is that the individual good is for the sake of the common good. Quite possible. I don't think that it's required by the text, but more broadly, what I want to say is I don't see that the point of this is to make a point about the goods being teleological. So first of all, even if it were to somehow be that if we very cleverly think about 17 passages here and about the commitments of each of them, it turns out that they result in a commitment to teleology. That doesn't seem to me to be the point that Socrates is making here. First of all, but second of all, I don't think that one would need to think that the individual good is for the sake of, and does Anaxagoras think? I mean, Socrates is in a sense saying, here's what I expected Anaxagoras to tell me. Would Anaxagoras think that the individual good is related to the common good? And maybe just one last thing, it's not clear to me that Plato thinks that the individual good is always for the sake of the common good. At least I'm somewhat sympathetic to this paper that Emily Fletcher has coming out that argues that the individual good in the Timaeus is in conflict with the common good. So that if, as it were, every individual soul managed to get into a star, the cosmos would be screwed over. The cosmos needs to be entirely ensouled. And so there's a good for the whole cosmos. There's a good for my soul, which is to end up in a star. There's a good for the cosmos, which is for the whole cosmos to be ensouled. But if every individual soul succeeded in achieving its good, it would be bad for the cosmos. And so there's a case in which it's not clear even within Plato that Plato thinks that the individual good is going to be serving the common good. Now, of course, Fletcher could be wrong, but I think it's sort of nice to have a concrete example of how those two things might come apart, could be plausibly seen as coming apart. Does that?
Yeah. I mean that's very helpful. Yes. But I was wondering whether then you thought that let's say local explanation of good at the level of each thing was some sort of formal causation. I mean, maybe it's anachronistic to put the things in these terms, but if it is not final causation, then it may be just sort of formal explanation.
It might just be a sort of formal explanation. To be clear, what I wanted to say is his strong commitment is to, if everything is explained by nous, everything will be done in the way that's best. Will there be some sort of large subordinated structure in which there is a thing which is the final goal and everything else is explained why it's best in terms of it? Maybe. I would be happy if Anaxagoras gave me that. Or will there be some other sort of account of the good in which each individual fact is sort of directly explained, as you say, in a kind of formal causal way, from just, well, here's why this is the best? Yeah, maybe that would work too. Socrates doesn't know what the good is. He doesn't know what it's going to look like. That's what Anaxagoras was supposed to tell him. Anaxagoras is the one who knew what the good was like. I think sort of assuming a teleological conception is to make a substantive claim about the nature of the good, which is precisely what Socrates wants to rescind from doing.
Okay, thanks, David, a lot. I mean, it's now 2 p.m. I don't know. Ricardo has another question. If you have time, maybe we can.
I certainly have time.
Okay, we can
talk to me about the Fido.
linger for a bit more. Yes, Ricardo.
Thank you. Look, it's
maybe I should say though, for anyone who wants or needs to leave, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. It's been an extremely useful discussion. So thank you. And yeah, please take it away, Ricardo.
Yes, thank you. Well, one question. It's now 2 questions, I'm afraid, but I mean, you don't have to answer them if you don't want to. It's one is connected to the previous question by Edgar and your response to Edgar, which is this. I mean, if you look at the next great philosophical system in antiquity, where nous is given a central place, namely Aristotle. Now, in Aristotle, well, why does the prime mover, the unmoved mover thinks? Is it because it is good for it to think, or it's the other way around? I mean, is it because the unmoved mover thinks that it is good? It looks as though, well, as far as I understand, in Aristotle, what the unmoved mover does is the ultimate source of value. No, so and if that's correct, then Aristotle's account of the ultimate source of value would differ from that of Anaxagoras, because, as you were saying at the beginning, in connection to my first question, you would say, well, why does the Anaxagorean nous does anything? Well, it does it because it is good. So there is an account of goodness, according to your reconstruction of Anaxagoras. There is an account of goodness that is prior to nous, no? So I mean that may well be. I mean, Aristotle and Anaxagoras don't have to agree, of course. And but I was, I mean, in my understanding of Anaxagoras, I was led, driven a bit by my understanding of Aristotle. So that's why. And the other question is this, David. Well, it's totally unconnected to the topic of today's talk, which is, what are your views about this passage, this later passage in the Phaedo, the cosmological passage in Phaedo in 107c, 115a, where at that point in the dialogue, Socrates presents an account of the underworld, and of the sources, of the cosmos and things like that, and he associates this cosmology with Homer. I think he mentions Homer. If the reference is 112a2.
Yeah.
He mentions Homer as the author of this cosmology. But many scholars have hypothesized that the real character behind this cosmology is Anaximander. So do you have any views about that? I mean, what's your opinion about this?
Okay, good. I mean, I have a lot of views there, and of course,
Yes.
a whole chapter on it. And I should say, if there's any parts of the Phaedo that people are particularly interested in, I'm happy to send you the relevant chapter on that. Just drop me an email, and I'm always happy to share my work, of course. So on the first question, it's a tricky question, but so maybe the first thing that I should say is it's in part because of this that I want us to try to approach thinking about nous from the Socratic dialogues and from the Meno rather than from Aristotle, because Aristotle has loomed so large in how we've gone back and read this. And this, of course, influenced Aristotle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's how Plato was thinking about nous at the time. Now, it's an interesting question why nous is the best thing for Aristotle. And I guess I was thinking a little bit about the sort of formal features of goodness that we get, for example, in Nicomachean Ethics 1:7 or in 10:7, in terms of being a pure activity, being complete, being self-sufficient. There are these things, we could say in virtue of what nous is best. At least I don't know if we should just view those as signs that is it in virtue of being complete that it's best, or is it just a sign of what's best that it's complete? I mean, that sort of explanatory direction, again, I'm not quite sure of, but there might be something that you could say there, and that might end up being a little bit like Plato's form of the good, or something that's a sort of substantive account of what it is for something to be good. Obviously, there's big, arguments that good is not univocal and these sort of things in Aristotle. But okay, so now let me come to your second question about the cosmological section. And I do have like a big story on the cosmological section. I think it's super interesting, and that there's a lot of stuff in there that has not been really carefully worked through. And so that's definitely a significant part of my book. So maybe I should say one thing is, I think that there are distinct sections to the cosmological account that Socrates carefully marks off as having different epistemological statuses. And people tend to just call the whole thing a myth, but that's not what Socrates calls it. And so there's one part of it that he says, this I've been convinced of by somebody. And that's not the part that he says is a muthos. The part that he says is a muthos, he says, it would be foolish to insist upon it. But there's another part that he says that he's convinced of. and those look like they're different. At least it seems so to me. Now, one reason why people have thought that Anaximander is in the background is in the part that he says that he's convinced of, we get this argument for why the earth we wouldn't need to give an explanation for why the earth is in the center, because we get this sort of, it has no more reason to go one way than another. And so if there's no reason to go one way rather than another, and it's in the center and it's a sphere, we don't need to give an account. And that looks a little bit like some of our testimony about Anaximander, although David Furley has questioned that testimony because it looks too much like Plato, right? I mean, so there are tricky questions there. But I guess what I want to say is, I think we could potentially see distinct sources in his cosmological account, depending on what part of the cosmological account we're in. And this bit that he's been convinced of, okay, we get this thing that may be coming from Anaximander. We also get some stuff that I argue looks very much like the way that forms work. So we get a form-like cosmology, in which the heavens, we have the sun itself and the stars themselves. We get this use of auta, and those things are pure. And those pure things operate in a different way than the way that things work down here. And so that looks very Platonic. Later parts, some people have wanted to think have Pythagorean sources, and there are some Orphic poems that maybe look similar to this. But what I will say is, throughout the book, my general approach is to think that Plato is never just taking over an idea from some predecessor. He's always appropriating it, fitting it into his own structure, his own goals and purposes, and doing something distinct with it. So it's insightful for us to see the background. I think the background is important, as you see with my stuff on early medicine here, but it's also important not to think, oh, so he's just doing the same stuff as we find in on-ancient medicine. Absolutely not. And I think that the same thing is happening there. Maybe I'll mention one thing here, which is there's talk of Aitia in the Mythos, and I haven't seen a clear account earlier of how this relates to what we get in the autobiography. So one thing that I try to do is to show how, and this is stuff that David Sedley did some of the work on in a classic article, seeing the connections between the autobiography and the cosmological section, but I think that there's more that can be done there and how he's thinking through what causes would look like in natural science, in cosmology in particular there. All right.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks, David, and everyone for staying and till this hour. I mean, it has been a very fruitful meeting. David, thanks for accepting our invitation. A very interesting discussion as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the discussion. Lovely to meet some of you. Nice to see you, Gabriele.
Yes, hi, Gabriele. How are you?
Hi.
Hi, guys. Thank you, David. It was very nice. I'm thinking about the differentiation right now. Back in a while to you.
Okay, well, then we're going to end the session, and thanks a lot to everyone, and maybe next time we can meet in person, David.
And
Yes.
In Mexico.
Link, we'll
Yes.
send you the link, David, of the YouTube video.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks again for the invitation.